Hi, gentlemen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, fantastic, good. And as usual, I can see my faders moving, so I think we're recording just fine as well. Welcome to this very special Calico Live. We haven't actually announced this one yet, just we wanted to make sure the recording actually happened and we were happy with it. But it's to celebrate the fifth anniversary of Calico. So, although it's Calico Live, this time we haven't been able to get the calendar scheduling to work out for us. So the title is a bit misleading. I'm afraid it's pre-recorded. This is a week being recorded a week early, just because of calendar conflicts and so on. But apart from that, everything will be as usual. So just to introduce us all. You probably know me by now. I'm Chris Tomkins. I'm a developer advocate at Tigera. I champion our users and our community, and I've worked in networking for a long time, around 20 years. I got interested in automation and large-scale, SDN and software fabrics, and I'm interested in anything in those areas, and that led me to Kubernetes. Shaun, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name's Shaun Crampton. I'm a distinguished engineer at Tigera. I look after a bunch of Calico components. So our data plane component, Felix, our per host agent, Typha, our proxy, and various other things besides.
Fantastic. And we have a very special guest. Ratan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely, Chris. Hi, my name is Ratan Tipirneni. I'm President and CEO of Tigera. I'm a software engineer turned entrepreneur. I work here in Silicon Valley all my professional life. Started off by building mostly Unix kernel stuff, file systems, virtual memory, device drivers, did that for several years. Then went on to build some high performance embedded storage software for a few years. And since then, I've been an entrepreneur building software companies, which I greatly enjoy.
Fantastic, great intro. Yes, I'm definitely the poor man in the room in terms of software development knowledge, I'm afraid. But I could probably hold my own just about, I think. And I suppose we should just say what Calico Live is, although this is a special one, so it's a little bit different. Calico Live's an informal video series that we've been doing. We have, up until the sessions before this one, have all been around eBPF and kind of deep dives into the data plane and learnings about that. They've been really successful, and Shaun and I have really enjoyed doing them. Then we've got today's special session with Ratan, and we'll be just talking a bit about the kind of journey that Calico's been on, and how we got to where we are today, our strengths and weaknesses, and then the future. And after this session, we will have Casey, who is a principal software engineer, I believe, and he will be joining us to talk on a number of subjects. I believe the first one will be the additional network policy for services functionality that he's added recently. But that's all for next time. So let's start drilling in really into our session for today. So I thought it would be nice to talk about all of our backgrounds with Project Calico and Tigera, and mine is the shortest. People will know that I've been with the organisation about 9 months now, which has been a tremendous time for me. So let's do mine last, I suppose. Shaun, did you want to kick us off? How did you first come to be involved with Calico?
So I was working at a company called Metaswitch, which was where the Calico project started. And I joined the team after probably about 3 or 4 months, I think, after someone had the original idea. The original idea behind Calico way back when was to bring an elegant approach to networking to OpenStack. This was before Kubernetes even existed. Although that's kind of our home now, but this was way back when. The sort of big idea was to bring the networking approaches that are used to power the internet. So using technologies like BGP and route aggregation make the networking in OpenStack a lot more efficient and a lot simpler. So at the time, the prevalent technologies there used layers upon layer of overlay, and they were designed to support big kind of like isolated layer 2 fabrics, to make it easier to move programs kind of wholesale up into your OpenStack cluster. And we saw an opportunity to sort of bring a much simpler approach that was a lot easier to deal with and a lot easier to debug and a lot easier to kind of maintain.
Yeah, I remember we talked about this briefly once before, didn't we? That actually, my personal journey ties into that. I must remember to bring that up when we talk about that, about the simplicity of the BGP element of it. I'll come back to that, I think. Cool. And how about you, Ratan?
So I've been here at Tigera for about 4.5 years, and it was purely accidental. Me getting introduced to the Calico Tigera team and coming on board. I just finished my last startup. I decided to take just a few months off, and I like to do this between startups just to step back, up level, reflect a little bit both on my past experience and what I wanted to do next. So I was toying with some ideas to go found a company, and when this introduction happened, this just was so exciting, and I felt like I'd get a head start because, as Shaun described, the team by then had spent about 11 or 12 months already, building out Calico Tigera on top of all the prior work that was done. And it was in a pretty exciting area and domain that I greatly enjoyed. So decided to come on board. So that was more on the technology side. On the entrepreneur in me, I saw an opportunity to walk in and join a team of 20 engineers and to really build a business out. And I saw a pretty phenomenal opportunity to build a great business. And I was incredibly excited to be able to come in and be able to paint on a blank canvas in terms of just building out the entire business, the go-to-market, and everything else. So that was one part of it. The other part, Chris, I'd say, is a little bit of the engineer in me that was super excited when I came across this opportunity on two dimensions. The first is when I went around and polled people in the community about Calico just to get some quick feedback and do a quick check on how the pulse of how people felt about it. It was pretty amazing that everyone came back and they all used 3 words to describe Calico. They said, "Hey, it just works."
Yeah.
And the first time, it sounded a little bit spooky and felt like a setup. I thought someone was playing a prank on me because I said, "How can different people use the same words to describe this?" But after having spoken with enough people, I knew this wasn't a setup. I knew that's how people genuinely felt about Calico. And that is just such an incredible compliment to Shaun and Casey and Rob and Neil and others who were the early engineers who built out Calico. Because having been an engineer, I know that to earn feedback like that from the community sometimes takes a decade or two to really stabilize the software. So I knew that there was something great about Calico. I didn't know the specifics, but I was using the end user feedback really as a proxy to know that this was an incredible product that they built. The second part of that, the engineer in me, the software engineer in me, I was incredibly excited just about Kubernetes itself. I have a long background in building operating systems. I built out a distributed file system before, and that's when I got to appreciate just the complexity of building anything at a distributed level in system software, right? I mean, building distributed applications is hard enough, but you're trying to do that at the system level. There's an order or several orders of more complexity. When I read about the story about Borg, which inside Google, which was the genesis of Kubernetes, I was incredibly both fascinated and I just wanted to participate in that ecosystem. And at that time, I had a thesis which said that I said, if I were to fast forward and project how the story would play out in the world of Kubernetes, uh, my thesis was that there were very few businesses who were trying to be distributors or distros of Kubernetes that would succeed, because I didn't think there was a sustainable value proposition in those businesses. My thesis was that there were three areas where if you could attack those related to Kubernetes, you could build a multi-billion-dollar sustainable business. And the three areas are storage, networking, and security. And so I knew that Kubernetes would be incredibly disruptive to all three areas in the technology stack. And someone would have to go figure out and address and maybe purpose build something that was more suitable for Kubernetes in these three layers of the technology stack.
Yeah.
And Tigera was attacking two out of this, and Calico, we were attacking two out of those three areas. And so I knew that there was something in here, there was a seed in here where we could take this and nurture it and build a multi-billion-dollar business, which was our aspiration. So that was the thesis I had. And again, if I can take another minute to maybe provide an example specifically of that. So if you look at storage, if you look at all the innovation in storage over the last 2 to 3 decades in enterprise, and there have been billions of dollars of value created by companies in the storage space. But they all make one very simple assumption, which is that the data is stateful, right? And that works fine when you have static workloads. But when you have dynamic workloads, which are getting orchestrated and spun out, that's with the notion of a stateful workload, right? Those two are very incompatible. So someone had to go solve that problem around storage, just as an example, to make sure it is compatible with the world of Kubernetes. And if you extend that to networking or security, it's the same underlying principles, right? And if you look at how the last 4.5, 5 years have played out, a lot of those assumptions have come true, and that's why I'm so excited both about Calico and Tigera, and honestly, anyone else in the Kubernetes ecosystem that's solving these same problems.
Yeah, I can. So I think I'll jump a little bit into how I came into this, because I think it ties into both to both of what you were saying. What both of you are saying, I should say. So, because I had almost exactly the same experience where, as I said, I've been interested in kind of SDN and large-scale automation for a long time, and I dabbled with Big Switch and with Juniper Contrail and many other things, and I'm just calling out two names, but I dabble with an awful lot more than those, and MPBGP and EVPN and all these things, and we were doing proof of concepts inside my organization, and they were complicated. And I've been doing networking a long time, and in that particular space, I know what I'm talking about. And yet, I was finding it hard to grasp on some of the concepts, and I was finding things unreliable and so on. And that's why when I came to finally discover Calico, the fact that it was simple BGP rather than MPBGP or anything else really appealed to me in terms of understanding, and I think that's been a strong point for us. And I almost definitely did use the term "it just works" myself, and I know it sounds like a marketing thing or something, but I'm sure I did say that internally. After all these other things we tried that were just too complicated or not quite ready, or even the business was nervous because they were just so complicated that even if we could get it working, there'd be two people in the organization who would understand how it worked. Whereas simple BGP, any good network engineer will understand it. Shaun, you had an interesting anecdote, didn't you, about your KubeCon talk?
Oh yeah,
I thought that was interesting.
I think that was when we were really starting to take off, and it really started to feel like quite exciting and like we were onto something. So this was sort of after we'd made the move to start focusing more on Kubernetes. We had some success in OpenStack, but it's a very mature market. Wasn't kind of growing at any kind of pace. So, incremental gains and then Kubernetes came along. The technology that we built kind of the two pieces. We built the networking, and we designed that for kind of elegant scale out to be able to handle millions of workloads in a data center, that kind of thing. Just going to that next order of magnitude, building the network like an internet network, which we know can handle billions of devices. But at the same time, we'd also built a security engine. So the idea was that we would take connectivity and do it in as simple a way as possible. And then we would build the security engine, to implement network policy, first for OpenStack. Then we helped kind of get the Kubernetes network policy kind of bootstrapped, and we were maybe the first implementation of that, and sort of the initial reference implementation. We designed that as a sort of separate component that ran orthogonally to the networking. And that all kind of dovetailed, and it worked really nicely for Kubernetes, because when you move from OpenStack, you're talking about VMs. They have a lifetime of hours to days to weeks. When you talk about pods, they have a lifetime of minutes or seconds, pods in Kubernetes. But if you design your network to kind of scale and deal with that churn and have that kind of aggregated design where you're not publishing routes throughout the whole network every time any pod changes, you can handle millions and millions of workloads coming and going, and just aggregate all the problems away like happens in the internet. So Kubernetes sort of started to take off, and we'd kind of dovetailed really nicely with the approach that they'd taken. And so I was going to KubeCon London, which I think might have been the first European KubeCon, and I was doing a sidetrack talk. Of course, this was back in the early days of Kubernetes, so maybe like 500 people in total at the whole of KubeCon, which seems crazy now. 10,000, 10,000, 20,000, however much they're up to. But I was due to give a talk, and I asked, okay, how big's the room going to be? Like, what equipment am I going to have? And, they showed me into the room, and, I was getting set up. And then with like 10 minutes to go, they came and said, so your talk is oversubscribed. Would you mind if we put you on the keynote stage?
That's great.
So I went to my first KubeCon and ended up giving a presentation on the main stage.
Great.
Admittedly, only to about 300 or 400 people, not to like the 15,000 or whatever it was in the last one. But I have stood on a KubeCon keynote stage and given a presentation. So that was the first time I sort of felt, wow, this thing's going somewhere. Like people really want this. They need it. It's solving their problem. And yeah, that was my experience of KubeCon London.
Yeah, that's a great story, Shaun. I'd actually not heard about that, you being on the main stage, but also, it's hard for me to visualize KubeCon only having 500 attendees after having been to the last one in San Diego, where the entire place was just overflowing with attendees. That's pretty amazing.
I'm really interested to hear what the attendance is like this year, the physical attendance at KubeCon North America, because we have presence there, and sadly I won't be there. I wish I could be this year, but it'll be really interesting to see how that, but let's not talk about COVID. Let's talk about anything except COVID. Cool. Ratan, I was just looking at our notes and thinking about that. I think we've chatted over most of it, but is there any overlap? I don't think you answered this already. Apologies if you did, but was there any networking component in your earlier roles before Tigera or?
Yeah, no, definitely. There was. So I'd worked both in networking and to some extent security, not as much as security, but mostly networking. I spent a few years at Cisco and got to work a little bit in networking. And if I can just actually maybe use this opportunity, Chris, to build on what Shaun said, One of the great things I noticed, and candidly, I didn't get insight into this until after I came on board. It's just the architecture and design of Calico, because if just to pick up on what Shaun said, 5 years ago, it was anything but obvious that Kubernetes was going to take off in a big way. I felt the field was pretty wide open. There were other really great orchestrators like Mesos as an example, and OpenStack was still in the running in the race. And so it was anything but obvious which of them was going to take off. And even till today, we have people from OpenStack and maybe some Mesos using Calico. I think the power, and again, credit to all the engineers and architects who designed Calico, that the fact that they designed it in such a way that it was independent of the underlying orchestrators, that it was still applicable even though the landscape changed, I thought was just simply brilliant. And that I think goes back to the core philosophy we have towards Calico and at Tigera, that from an architecture and design, you just never ever want to get too rabid about any single technology, because we all know these technologies come in waves, and it's only a matter of time before something changes. But we're really designing something, that's future-proof, that enterprises can bet on for decades.
Yeah, well, when I came on board, actually, I had the opposite experience to what you often have, where sometimes you join. So just to take a backward step. As well as enjoying the technology, I actually dealt quite a bit with Lance and Shaun in our community, and realised that I thought it was a really great supportive community, and which we're trying to continue to this day, and that we have pretty good documentation, and that really helped to sell me on the product. But the reason I mention that is because then I thought I had a pretty rosy view of Calico, and I joined up expecting that, as you often do, to then see the kind of can of worms behind the initial view, but the reality was better than I expected. This is one of my favorite topics, as you know, but the modularity of the way the software is built is so elegant, and it really lends itself to that, to what you said. It allows you to match a workload is a workload. It doesn't matter so much. I mean, I have to be careful because obviously I'm not contributing as heavily to the code as Shaun is, so I don't want to oversimplify it. But a workload is a workload, and the modularity allows you to fit the software and not to get too entrenched or embedded in any technology. Even though Kubernetes is hugely successful, there's no reason we can't adapt equally well to anything else.
Yeah. And Chris, if you don't mind, let me build on one of the comments you just made about the documentation. It's interesting, your observation about the documentation. So my experience when I first came on board was a little bit diametrically opposite. In my first few months, we went out and polled the community about what they wanted to see us do better. And the number one thing was documentation. There were some unprintable comments that we received in terms of feedback about the quality of our documentation. But it says a lot about our team, both in their ability to listen and to respond. We took that up as a challenge, and we went out and built some incredible documentation to a point where someone like yourself, who came on board recently, if you felt it was great, that's an incredible compliment to the whole team here.
Yeah, I think, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. I don't think it's perfect. I think it's almost impossible to have perfect documentation, but I think it's pretty great, really, considering and I suppose we can talk about that. We can jump forward a little bit, and because we're going to talk about. So we've talked a bit about how we got to where we are, and we're going to chat a little bit about kind of strengths and challenges. But the flip side to that documentation point is, one of our bigger challenges, I think, is that sheer diversity of supported technologies and environments means that even with the kind of effort that you put in and the obvious dividends it paid, it is still incredibly hard to have accurate documentation. And what I'm seeing as well is that because we support public clouds and so on, we're building on shifting sands essentially, because if we're plugging into someone else's API and someone else's documentation, that's not to say that it will be identical in 3 months. And that's, we're not the only ones to face this challenge, but it's an interesting challenge, and I don't entirely know what the full answer is.
Yeah, no, you're right about that, Chris. I definitely, that's a good observation. Just the diversity of the platforms out there, and really the permutations and combinations that are possible that are pretty complex to be able to even support and document all that stuff. But I'd say, perhaps one thing we could do is to look at history of the technology business and draw some parallels from this. And I can tell you from personal experience, this is not the first time it's happened in the industry. Again, if you go back maybe 15, 20 years, and you just look at the operating system landscape, and the operating systems were still, they were still shifting in terms of who's going to dominate. And one of the big challenges they ran into was just the number of device vendors that they had to support and the device drivers they had to author. And it was just unbelievable, the number of vendors who were putting out SCSI devices or network devices. There were so many. It felt like, at least in Silicon Valley, every other building was one company popping up. And the operating system vendors had this huge burden to support all that. So you fast forward by a decade, so two things happened. One is, the number of these device vendors consolidated, and so did the operating systems. And the problem itself became a little bit simpler. So I feel like we're kind of going through that wave right now within Kubernetes with just the number of vendors and the permutations. But ultimately, this will start to stabilize, and it'll become more of a finite problem at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Shaun, was there anything you wanted to add on
that? I can explain a little bit of how we do try to deal with that problem. So I think testing is pretty deep in our DNA, has been from the very start. Automated testing. I mean, like when we first started with we were building out our OpenStack solution, I think we were some of the people who were running like the biggest OpenStack clusters, because we needed to test our product on, we had to learn how to build a 2,000 node OpenStack cluster, and we built up that expertise in our test team, which I think very few people could do that at that time. And it's been the same, like when we moved to Kubernetes, it was, table stakes. We have to have tests. We have to be running Kubernetes end-to-end tests in all the environments that we support. I haven't counted them in a little while, but I think we run over 300 permutations of Kubernetes end-to-end tests in our regular, either nightly or every 2 nights or once per week runs. So we try to cover as many platforms as we can. For all of those, we run tests with multiple versions of Calico. We run tests with different options turned on and off. So different data planes, for example, IP tables data plane, the BPF data plane. We run on different operating systems. So typically Red Hat and Ubuntu are the main ones that we test with. And then we run across different Kubernetes distributions, because they all have their quirks, and some of them are more different than others. So we run vanilla Kubernetes, which covers a lot of bases. We run on OpenShift. We run like MKE. We run RKE. We run on all these different platforms. And yeah, we just have a huge matrix. Monitoring that matrix is a serious job, and trying to keep all of those green as the sands shift.
Yeah, if I can,
EKS and everything. Yeah.
Sorry, Shaun. If I can just build on that for just a second. Most teams and companies, when they talk about building IP, usually they're talking about it in the context of customer-facing products that they ship. But to build on what Shaun said, we built an incredible amount of IP, just software that does all the automation that he's talked about. And, we've kind of productized it. We've got a name for it. Internally, we've even dabbled with the idea of I do think, we could honestly, there's so much IP in there, we could take it out and ship it and actually build a business. Actually, I've had investors reach out to me where other portfolio companies are struggling with the same problem. And I said, hey, we've got it solved. It's fully automated. And we do this across all matrix, and we run like daily builds and automated tests. And that is a problem that most companies are just now starting to think about. And our team's already solved that.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, you're not the first one to say that to me, that the internal tooling is great in that sense. And it, again, a fun anecdote that occasionally when when I'm doing course notes and things, I need to go back to brass tacks and build a cluster without using our internal tooling to demonstrate how you do this. And if I go long enough without building on a particular platform, it's painful, because I with our automation, it makes it so much easier. So then I have to relearn the steps that the automation is performing for us. But I think the testing is great, and I think it's a really valid point that it's got us to a really strong point. And one thing I'd like to do is to move more of that. I was chatting with Lance the other day about this. Move more of that into the documentation side as well, and have more kind of test suites of the documentation than we currently do. It's challenging because obviously not everything has a CLI. There are certain things where you need to There are even tools that I'm finding where you use a CLI for 99% of it, and then you're forced into the GUI to press next once or twice, and those kind of things are really difficult. If you can capture that in a document, but how do you test it? Or how did you test it in an automated fashion, I should say? We're taking the right steps, though, I think, to keep that documentation up to date. And I think, as we said before, that amazing support for heterogeneous environments and and multi-cloud and on-prem and all that is a great strength. So the other thing, the other strength that that I particularly was focused on was that idea of building entirely on blocks of reliable tools like BGP, and how you solve, Shaun, I imagine consciously you solve those two problems independently. I almost like to think of it as getting really good, really reliable, really simple reachability, and then cutting off that reachability intentionally with network policy, and treating those as two separate problems and solving those both in scalable ways that an engineer knows will scale, like IP tables and like BGP that have provably solved these problems for a long time, and yet still having the modularity that allows us to go forth and support eBPF and VPP and other cool technologies going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that idea was sort of there before I joined the project, but so that was Christopher Lillian-Stolpe who sort of came up with the original idea, I think, one of Tigera's founders. And he had a background in running kind of intercontinental networks for the likes of Cable and Wireless and people like that who have these big networks. And he said his benchmark was he needed to be able to debug a problem and solve it in one of those intercontinental networks handling terabits of traffic across like millions and millions of users. He needed to go from getting the page in the middle of the night to having it resolved in 15 minutes, or the solution was too complicated. But debugging an OpenStack network at the time was too complicated by his measure. It took a long time, and that kind of led to the kind of counterpoint to that is, well, if you're not doing your security using network segmentation, then how do you do it? And the back and forth in sort of engineering team, I think, came up with, well, we should do it using proven technologies wherever possible. So, the kernel is a hardened thing that's already there. IP tables is already there. It's battle tested. We know it works. We'll start with that.
Yeah, I always really liked the idea of breaking out, of scaling the network policy with the compute, because anyone who's ever had to buy a pair of beefy gigabit or multi-gigabit firewalls knows how much they cost, and that's because you're trying to buy a single device or a pair of devices to do this security at insane performance levels, and it makes so much more sense to break out some of the horsepower of your compute nodes to distribute your security in the same way that you're distributing your workloads.
Yeah, and I would say one of the key things that we cottoned onto, like fairly early on, was just the idea of trying to use the identity of the workloads and the labels and metadata that you have on the workloads to define your policy. And then when Kubernetes came along, and that's like the natural way that you define everything in Kubernetes, it's all labels and selectors. That just like dovetails really nicely with that approach.
Yeah, it's perfect because obviously IPs are totally ephemeral, and
yeah, your IPs are ephemeral, they're coming and going. And I think one thing we cottoned onto was that IP tables was robust, but in order to make it perform, you need to use other technologies in the kernel, like originally IP sets were where we went for that. So we were able to map selectors very efficiently onto IP sets in the kernel, and those are very efficient to update. You can add and remove IPs at 1,000 IPs per second if you're hitting churn of 1,000 pods per second. And we tested all of that way back when to make sure we could handle the sorts of churn levels that a system like Kubernetes can generate. So that was all kind of fun work to get data plane updates flowing through at thousands of updates per second, even as you have like ephemeral pods coming and going.
Did you and I ever talk about Lisp, the protocol? I feel like we might have chatted about this once before. I'm going to nerd out slightly and go slightly off topic, but this always, when we talk about IP addressing and using labels, there's this protocol Lisp, which I just Googled. I didn't Google the protocol because I know what it is, but I Googled what the acronym because I couldn't remember it. Locator Identifier Separation Protocol. And it's this protocol that I think came out of the IETF, but possibly from Cisco before that. It's not widely deployed in my experience, which was why I don't know that detailed history well. But the reason is because it's a really interesting protocol to read up on, because what they're trying to solve is the concept that, and right now an IP address tells you two things. It tells you network location and device address, device identifier, and really no single number should be doing both of those jobs. You should have one number that tells you where you are in the network and one number that identifies you, and because those are two fundamentally different things. And yet somehow we've ended up using IP addresses for both. And Kubernetes is great because it takes away that paradigm of using IP addresses for anything other than reachability. I guess it's another example of how Calico was in the right place with the technology at the right time.
Yeah, I would say conceptually we're all operating at that label level. Implementation detail, the way we do it at the moment is with IP addresses and keeping close track of pods coming and going. But yes, we'd be ready to take on a different approach in future.
Yeah.
Chris, for a minute there, I've got to confess that when you said Lisp, I experienced a little bit of PTSD because I thought you were referring to the programming language.
Oh, right.
And I had a horrendous bug at one time in my software that took me weeks to debug. It was in Lisp, and so anyway, that recursive type of programming just brought back some PTSD memories for a few seconds.
Yeah, I've never touched Lisp. I've never touched Lisp. The Lisp
Good,
the program.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you. Stay away from that.
Stay away from it. Yeah. There's no such thing as a middle ground opinion on a programming language. Anyone who's ever been exposed to any program, you have to have an extreme view of every programming language that you've ever been exposed to. In my experience.
Programming language and editors, yeah. If you want to ever start a dialogue on VI versus Emacs, there's never middle ground there.
my first year of university, my university switched to Java as the language for the course, and this was when, as we learnt, running Java on Sun Solaris and running on Windows did not produce compatible things, despite the fact that was the objective of the language. You could not compile on one and run on the other, or compile to bytecode, I should say. But yeah, so I have the same kind of PTSD about Java, even though I like the concept.
Yeah.
Would you like to get your boot into any languages while we're on the subject, Shaun?
I'm a big fan of Golang.
Oh, it's good to stay positive. It's good to stay positive. Yeah.
I did like Java when I worked in Java. A lot of people find it don't like it, but I felt like I had quite a good relationship with that one. I'm not a massive fan of C. I think it's had its time and could do have been replaced by something better. I haven't actually done much in, say, Rust. That one looks interesting.
Yeah, I know very little about Rust, if I'm honest with you.
On Java,
I hate JavaScript.
Well, just the naming, even just the naming of JavaScript bothers me. The fact that it implies it's in some way related to Java.
Yeah. So Java, I do have affinity to Java, not because of the elegance of the language, as much as I worked at Sun for a while.
Right.
I still remember the first time James Gosling came up and shared his views on Java before it was released. So I remember sitting in the hall listening to his talk. So emotionally, I have an affinity to Java, not so much whether it's elegance or not, but here I'm going to say I'm a pretty big fan of C. Just the surgical precision it gives you and the ability to tune some of the performance. So I continue to be a big fan of C.
Cool. I suppose we should try to get back on topic, shouldn't we? It's my fault. I took us off topic. So Ratan, were there any other kind of advantages? We need to spare kind of 10 minutes or so to talk about the future a little bit. But before we move on to that, were there any other advantages or kind of advantages of our position or strengths that you wanted to share?
I just want to build on what Shaun said earlier. He articulated those really well. The one of the things I find really fascinating looking at Calico's architecture and design is, if I were to draw a parallel, I draw a tremendous amount of inspiration from the design just of the Unix operating system. It kind of gives me goosebumps thinking about it. It's so beautifully designed, it's so elegant. And mainly it's the simplicity of that, where they picked a few building blocks at an atomic level. And the layer of abstraction you draw, where you draw the line of abstraction is a very important design decision in building software. There's a natural impulse and a tendency to abstract everything, which then takes away your flexibility and the power of what you can do with any technology. And you keep it too low level and it's unusable. So finding that right level of abstraction is an incredibly important design decision. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I feel like Unix is enduring and has been able to reinvent itself and stay relevant over multiple decades is because they got the design right. It's so beautifully designed where you can mix and match and solve different kinds of problems. It's incredibly elegant. So when I look at Calico, I feel like it's very similar in its approach, and that's why it's been so enduring, where we've been able to deal with different orchestrators, and we can continue to stay the leader for the next several decades, and there may be other technologies that come along at the data plane level and we will embrace every one of them. But we've got a built-in design that enables us and allows us to do that, to stay relevant with the latest technology, and that really explains, our multi-data plane approach. And again, one of the mistakes I feel we consistently make in the technology business is to assume that the latest technology that is in vogue is going to be the last greatest invention, and it's going to disrupt everything in the past, but that new technology will never get disrupted in the future. I mean, when you step back and think about that fallacy, it almost sounds silly. Mm. And that I feel like Calico has been beautifully architected and designed to avoid that trap and pitfall where we say, we started off with IP tables because that was the most practical thing to do. We're one of the leaders now with eBPF, thanks to Shaun and the rest of the team. We've got an incredible footprint in the market, growing exponentially by the hour. And then who knows, next year or in 5 years or in the next decade, there may be a different data plane, and there's nothing either religious for us or nothing technically that would prevent us from adopting the data plane. In a way, we've taken some baby steps towards, testing out a great data plane that Cisco's released to see if, that could be the next great thing. We don't know, right? Mm-hmm. But we just want to stay agnostic of things like that and not get into religious debates.
Well, actually, that's kind of a cool thing that it seems like we planned it, but we didn't. The interesting chat we had about kind of zealotry around programming languages, it is interesting how it is a thing in our industry that people like to tie their colors to a particular mask, whether it's Vim or Emacs or whatever, or Windows or Mac, whatever it is. People like to put a flag up. And I think something we do really well is to stay dispassionate and just look at what the tools can offer us and make use of them. There's no need to become obsessed with the technology. Just just look at the pros and cons. I think we're running low on time already. Actually, surprising. I'm just looking at the timer. I think the other great thing that we have is the strength of our community, and we have such a wonderful community, and even the strength of it when I came in, like I said, that was a driving factor. The support in the Calico users Slack, and I occasionally have to jump into Slack support channels for other open source projects, and the responsiveness of our environment and the community, not just of Tigera employees, but broadly, is fantastic and something I think that we don't take for granted at all. Something that we can continue to grow. So what else do you see, Ratan? I suppose it's best to go with you mainly with the future. How do you see us moving forward?
Yeah, so I'd say on a few different dimensions. So first is we have and will continue to lead on technology innovation. That's going to be very important for us. We invest quite a bit in innovating on technology to continue to maintain our leadership position. But to your previous point, which you articulated very well, Chris, we will strike the right balance between being pragmatic and leading with technology innovation. We never want to get to a point where we're overzealous or just we become rabid about something to a point where we stop listening to the community, the users, and lose touch with reality. So we're very keen on investing and staying, continuing to be the innovators in this space. The second area really is a deeper engagement with the community, and for all the incredible work our engineers have done, and mostly Calico is kind of spread through word of mouth. We do want to go deeper in our engagement with the community, and thanks to work by you, Chris, and Hard, and Reza, and others, we've really started to step that up. And I'd love to have a deeper engagement, a deeper dialogue with the community that is incredibly important for us in open source, and to bring people in. And the monthly community meetings that you and the rest of the Calico team are running are fantastic. And we just want to do more of that, participate more in meetups and really draw people into the dialogue and help them and listen to their input and have them influence our roadmap and direction. So that's the second thing. The third, I'll say, is more philosophical, which is one thing that will not change is we want to continue to provide choice to our users and to our customers, right? That's very core to our philosophy of what we do. And technology takes time to evolve. And so some of our users are still, whether they're working with Unix or Windows, or whether they're working with older versions of Unix or a combination of on-prem and the cloud, we want to provide choice to the users, everything from eBPF to IP tables to Windows. We'll support all the data planes and maybe VPP or some future data planes. But philosophically, that'll be an important thread in all the decisions that we make.
Excellent. Yeah, that's good. Shaun, was there anything else you wanted to add on that?
I don't think so.
Yeah, no, likewise. I think for my part, I think we are taking great steps with the community, but I feel like we can do better. Things take a lot of time, and it's difficult to decide how best to use the time that we have. But we have a few initiatives in the pipeline that we're thinking of to try to make the best possible use of our community. Because as you said, Ratan, people are telling us what they want. We just need to listen. So I think that's a really important point. I think in terms of technology choice, I 100% agree with the line we're taking. I think it's the right way to go. Cool. Well, I think we're coming up to the end of our time. Was there anything you guys wanted to chat about before we wrap?
The only thing I want to say, Chris, is one of the things I'm very proud of is that we have Calico users across the planet in 166 countries.
That's incredible.
And one of the highlights of my job and my role is there isn't a week that goes by where I don't hear from one of those users from somewhere on the planet saying something incredibly nice about Calico, and that I find incredibly energizing. And I can tell you that I have never ever worked in a company or worked with a product where we get such raving feedback. So I'm very grateful for that and for all the support from the community, from the users around the world. And in my heart, I'm a software engineer, and for every software engineer, there is nothing more energizing than to see the software that you've built being used to solve a real world problem somewhere. And in our case, we can say we are doing it at scale where we are powering some of the largest Kubernetes installations on the planet with unbelievable levels of scale that are just unimagined. I cannot take credit for building any of the software, but on behalf of the team, I'm just deeply proud of what we've accomplished together.
Yep, I had a little anecdote there. One of the members of my team, Tomas, was fixing a bug earlier on this week, and he offered a test build to a community member who'd brought the bug to our attention. And the community member turned around and said, "Yep, deployed that into production, 4,000 node, all working great, thanks." In his 4,000 node cluster running our eBPF mode. So there we go. That was a bit of a
that's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's 1.5 million nodes, isn't it? That's the number we have.
Yeah, that's correct. 1.5 million nodes across the planet. And actually, Shaun's comment about Thomas reminded me of another quick anecdote I'll share. It'll just take a few seconds.
Yeah, sure.
I just recently met up with one of the executives who's responsible for running one of the largest public clouds where they've got Calico embedded. And he was incredibly complimentary. He said, look, over the last 5 years, we've had nothing but success with Calico. There's never been a single instance where I've got an issue or a complaint from my team. So he was just very complimentary. And to be able to run at that scale, where you're powering one of the largest public clouds, I feel like not too many software teams can claim that level of success. So it's also a message for our team, very deeply proud of what our team's accomplished already and what we're about to do. I feel like the best is ahead of us.
Cool. I think that's a great place to leave it. Well, thanks very much, gents. Have a great rest of your morning, Ratan, and it's the evening where we are. So yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Chris, for hosting this.
No worries. Take care.
Disappearing, but thanks very much.